Okay, American history. We are at chapter 21, America and the Great War. The Great War begins in 1914. I can't go over everything, of course, in 10 minutes, but it had four causes: militarism, imperialism, nationalism, and alliances, and you'll read about those. The United States is going to try to stay out of it when it first begins, but it is a great war, and it's called the Great War because it was so terrible, the unprecedented horror, the slaughter that occurs because of industrialization, because of new weapons, and there was excessive nationalism that fueled the war, that made people think that they were better than other countries, and it just is just really terrible. So it wasn't known as World War I because World War II hadn't happened yet, and so the United States is trying to stay out of it, but will be drawn into it. Woodrow Wilson is president, having won that election in 1912 that had split the Republican Party. And Wilson campaigns after 2 years of war. In 1916, he runs for re-election, and his campaign slogan is "Vote for Wilson. He kept us out of war." And so he wins re-election in part because of that. And then a few months later, he says, we need to go to war. Why? Well, the United States had gotten drawn into the war because we were making a lot of money off of the war. We were sending weapons, supplies, food. War was good business for the United States. And of course, the Germans are trying to win the war, and part of the way they wanted to win the war was cut off the supplies that are coming to them. And so in the process, they sink some ships like the Lusitania. And the Lusitania was a passenger vessel. And boy, there's a good book about that called Dead Wake that tells the last voyage of the Lusitania. It was a sister ship to the Titanic, which had went down like 3 or 4 years earlier in 1912. And Lusitania is this huge ship like the Titanic. And the Germans were like, but they had weapons, they had supplies, war supplies and weapons in the cargo hold. And the British were like, no, we did not. You killed 1,100 innocent lives, including a lot of American lives, innocent people. The same technology that went and explored the Titanic, the same one that led to the deaths of people that went and looked at the Titanic this last summer, you remember that? That was used to go and look at the Lusitania. And lo and behold, what do they find in the cargo? Weapons. So the British had weapons on those, but they were supplying them. In the short term, the Germans agreed to stop sinking all ships, but after a while, they resumed that, in part because the Russians are going to get out of the war because they were losing badly. The war is stalemated on the Western Front. Neither side can win. There's trench warfare. But on the Eastern Front, Russia's losing badly. And it leads to a revolution, a communist revolution led by a guy named Vladimir Lenin. And so Vladimir Lenin promises the people peace, land, and bread. And so he's got to deal with the Russian Civil War for control of Russia between the royalists, the monarchists, the Republicans, people wanting a republic, and the communist. So that's the Bolshevik Revolution. Well, when Russia gets out of the war, that's very advantageous for the Germans because they were having to fight a war on two fronts, fighting Russia in the east and fighting the British and the French in the west. But there was also fighting going on because of imperialism in Africa and in Asia. And so now the Germans can focus. And so this war had been going on for 3.5 years. And so it becomes a battle of attrition, who can last the longest. And the Germans are struggling because being centrally located, they're more isolated, and they don't have access to all the supplies that the British do. The Germans did 10% of what we were supplying. We were going to the Germans. We were making money off of them too, but it was just 10%. Also, if the Germans win this war, because we started to loan money, banks started to loan money to the British, and like, oh, you cover it later because we're making so much money off of it. But if the Germans win, are we going to get that money back? And 90% of what we're selling is going to the Allied powers, not the Central powers, which included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And so Germany decides to resume submarine warfare, and that is going to draw in the United States. And so Woodrow Wilson says we need to go to war to make the world safe for democracy. And that way we can, he can say that legitimately because Russia's out of the war, because when Russia was in the war, you can't say that because Russia's not a democracy. It was an absolute monarchy. It was an autocratic society. But now he could say that, where this is the war to make the world safe for democracy. Of course, democracy would only include European people. It doesn't include the colonized people and the imperial possessions of Africa and Asia, because those people are beneath, they can't govern themselves. They're not as smart as Europeans. And that's the underlying principle of that, as hard as that is to say. And so the United States gets into the war. It transforms America. We actually restrict much free speech and democratic rights and things like that. There's all sorts of war propaganda, the Committee of Public Information. It's going to transform the role of women and transform the role of African Americans, and that's what wars can do. There can be unintended consequences that's going to reshape things after the war with things like civil rights and the emergence of feminism and the suffrage movement, and then the fear surrounding communism, and a lot of that stuff is part of what that discussion post is about. That's kind of where I was hoping you would go, about this fear that permeates racial relations, changing gender roles and gender norms, and fear of communism, and all of that transforms the United States. So with the introduction of the United States and fresh troops, the Allies are able to win the war. Wilson goes to Europe and is welcomed like a hero. There is a great PBS documentary called The Great War. You can stream that for free, and it's really good, The Great War. It came out just on the 100th anniversary, just a few years ago, and it was good. So, but he goes there and he's welcomed as a hero, and he has these 14 points. And this is going to make the world safe for democracy, and it was going to be the war to end all wars, because Wilson wanted to create a League of Nations where diplomacy would help to end war. But the British and the French want to punish the Germans, and so the treatment is actually really harsh. And thus, World War I will lead to World War II. It is a continuation. I mean, it's as if there's a 20-year break and then it's right back at it, because as bad as that war is, it doesn't solve anything. It was the turning point that failed to turn, it failed to solve the problems, and in some ways created these problems that would lead to the rise of autocratic dictators like Hitler and Mussolini and others. And so we'll be getting to that. So a lot to unpack in this chapter, The Great War. It is really, really interesting. I hope you'll find it as interesting as I do. And I know a lot of times the Great War is overlooked because so many people are interested in Hitler and Nazism and World War II. But you don't understand World War II if you don't understand World War I. You have to really study to understand that. And it's been ignored. But more recently, there's been more attention focused on it, partly because of that 100th anniversary. And a movie came out a few years ago called 1917. Really good movie about World War I that shows the horrors of the war and trench warfare and the absurdity of it, the killing that went on, and the absurdity of war. Another movie, too, that was remade, All Quiet on the Western Front. That was a classic movie. So there's some good things. I hope you can watch some of those because they're really good. And email me with questions as always. Thank you.